I want to start about, he's already said, Tony Abbott, that he is going to follow through and cut the carbon tax. He's also planning to cut the mining tax. Is this going to change the trajectory of Australian growth? Because the Australian economy is slowing.
Yeah, Australian economy is slowing. I mean, I think the most interesting thing about Tony Abbott at the moment is that he's not a deficit hawk. He's not trying to bring the Australian budget back to surplus. What he's really doing looks more like Ronald Reagan in 1982. It's a tax cuts play. So in addition to mining and the carbon tax, he's also pledged to reduce the company tax. And obviously the hope there is that that'll stimulate the economy and ultimately it'll increase revenue so the deficit will go down.
So we'll worry about the deficit blowout later.
Yeah, and he's really walked away. You know, this is a guy who spent 3 years criticising Labor for debt mountains. Now, in fact, the debt mountains by global standards are tiny, and I think Abbott also understands, to his credit, now's not the time for Australia to rush back to surplus because the Australian economy is slowing a bit. China's slowing, no more Chinese infrastructure spend, from which Australia has benefited enormously, and obviously we've seen the effects of the end of QE in the US with the carnage in emerging markets.
So can these tax cuts, particularly tax cuts which are going to affect Australian consumers, will it have enough power to actually get the economy heading in the right direction again, do you think?
You know, I think the big story for Australia is the global wins, not the domestic ones. You know, if you and you've got to think about the way the global economy filters through. So really, Australia avoided the financial crisis because of the Chinese infrastructure spend, which meant that mining investment in Australia went through the roof. Now that mining investment is coming off a bit, and I think what that means is that Australia's, in the longer term, got to look at its cost base, because it's costs that look like the big problem in the Australian economy.
Which Tony Abbott is looking at?
Abbott, well, we could do public sector and private sector costs. You know, the easiest cut for Tony Abbott is to cut the Australian public service. You know, bureaucrats are never popular. The only people who'll be unhappy about that are people who own houses in Canberra. But that's not going to balance the budget. And he said he's not going to look at the Australian labour relations system, which really has worker protections that look outmoded, I think, in a lot of the rest of the world these days.
So what you're saying really is, I mean, there's an awful lot of work to do to get Australia back on track. The global economy is going to have a lot to do with that. Overall, do you think that he's offering the right policy prescription for the Australian economy?
I don't think this was an election about policy. It was, Abbott said he wanted to be a grown-up in office, he wanted stability, and he was going to give the Australian people competence. Don't look for massive policy changes, look for a more grown-up government, and I think that'll help, because the fundamentals of the Australian economy are still extraordinarily strong, even if the next 12 to 18 months are probably going to be a bit rocky.
Chances of recession?
Low to no chance of recession. The only way it could have happened is if Abbott cut spending radically. He was smart enough to decide not to do that.